Okay, good morning. First off, I guess, are there any questions or things we should cover? I'll take that as a vote of no. Okay, what I want to do is going to spend a few minutes on finishing up on Samoans, Tongans, in other words, the other Polynesians, and then try to get through the Micronesians today. So all we've got left Tuesday, which is the last class, would be Southeast Asians and sort of a summary, which I'm sort of going to try to roll into these. So I finished up last time with Samoans and Tongans and some of the issues they have that are different than the populations before. For the Micronesians, I think I mentioned, for Micronesians and Southeast Asians, these same issues apply. The fact that there's no labor vacuum, it's a highly competitive work market. They're coming in here with real limited job skills. Their English competency isn't as good as it could be, even though ironically, in most of this region, English is the second language. But for almost all day-to-day operations in both Samoas and in Tonga, you can use Tongan or Samoan. There's very little, there's very few people and very little bureaucracy or anything that actually requires daily use of English. So you have a population which is familiar with English, but they're not necessarily particularly comfortable with it, which of course works against them because the only place you've got jobs here in Hawaii now in the 21st century is in the service sector. And that means pretty much by definition, you have to talk to people. So this is a population, and this is also true of Micronesians. These are populations which, if you just sort of looked at, the American influence has been there, British influence has been there, and you'd think, this gives them an advantage over, say, the Koreans in the early part of the century. But the reality is it's not, because it's not all that it seems. These areas, and especially Micronesia more so, are sort of on the very tail end of the colonial system. So the colonial system, whether it be the Americans in American Samoa or Guam, or the rest of Micronesia, whether it be the Brits/New Zealanders in Tonga or in Samoa proper, there's not really a huge amount of time, money, or interest spent on these groups. They're not very large. They're not politically important. And in global geopolitics, they don't even count, to be really blunt about it. So the American Congress is not going to lose a lot of sleep about that whole mess. What was it, a year and a half ago, with some American Samoa and immunization? I'm sure that if you asked any of the congressmen in the U.S. Congress, they wouldn't even know what the hell you were talking about. In fact, I hate to say it, but I suspect a fair amount of congressmen actually don't know that American Samoa is actually part of the United States. So if you're in one of these areas, it's sort of stunning how you can be part of something and yet that thing doesn't even know you exist. And this means that these groups do not have any leverage to make them more adaptable or more competitive, you might say. And from a cynical standpoint, if you're Hawaii or if you're the mainland United States, you don't want Samoans or Chamorro or other Micronesian groups to be more competitive, because you don't want them in your labor pool. In the sense, not anything against them, but you already don't have enough jobs for the labor pool you've got of what you might call, voting citizens in your state. So why do you want to bring another group in that's going to make life more complicated and cause stress? But really, in the 21st century, I don't think they're seen as a particular benefit to having them in state. This is certainly the state of Hawaii's attitude. Well, the only thing I forgot to mention last time, which I should have, which I don't think people remember, is you have to remember that of Samoa, Tonga, and American Samoa, only American Samoans have the right to travel to Hawaii or anywhere else in the mainland United States. If you're Tonga or you're from Samoa, the country of Samoa, you need a passport, visa, the whole immigration code, the whole 9 yards. That's the same as immigrating from Thailand or India or any place else. They are foreign countries. Now, Tonga and Samoa did have a relationship with New Zealand, but the population of Samoans and Tongans in New Zealand became so large and such an issue in New Zealand that they basically shut a lot of that down and made it very, relatively very difficult now to move to New Zealand vis-a-vis, say, 30 or 40 years ago, because they've got huge populations of Samoans, Tongans, especially in urban areas. And to be honest, they've been a problem in New Zealand society. They've not assimilated particularly well, and they're a large enough population that they're a visible issue in many ways. Here in Hawaii, not so much, because they're not really that large of a part of the population. And on the mainland US, which is where, large portion of the Samoans end up, they're not an issue because they're not even a drop in the bucket. You know, you figure the number of Samoans and Tongans in California versus total population, I'm sure it's in like 0.00 something percent. You know, they're not even on the chart, you know, in terms of a group. And you seriously, you see that with the Sons of Samoa, you know, gang video. They have to identify themselves as Samoan because no one else knows what they are. And to be honest, no one cares. In the leverage of, you know, numbers make power, they're not legit, you know, in the sense of being, you know, a group that can actually make a statement about who they are. So it's important to remember that what that means, for example, if you go to Maui, where there's a large Tongan population in Wai'ehu, you find that a fair number of those folks are illegal. Because for Tongans, but especially for Samoans, it was very easy, in fact, well, till COVID, to literally get on a ferry, go to, say, Samoa, which they and Tonga have a close relationship, and then literally take the ferry to American Samoa and just sort of, you know, vaguely get on a Hawaiian Airlines jet or something like that and end up in Hawaii. So it was really easy. And to be honest, you know, immigrations and customs are all focused on the Mexican border. They don't really pay that much attention to what Pacific Islanders, especially Polynesians, are up to. So there's been a huge discussion about just exactly how many Polynesians are here. Bob Franco over at KCC argues that basically the feds and the state, because they only track the legal ones, actually only have about 1/3 of the total numbers. So he argues that Samoans and Tongans in Hawaii are actually about 3 times higher than the official number, simply because the huge proportion of the population is technically illegal. You know, I wouldn't disagree with him. That's especially Samoans are his area of study, so I'm sure he's probably right. But this does lead to a huge amount of complications, because if you're here illegally, you know, it's very hard to put your kids in anything other than a public school. You know, you can't get grants, you can't get a loan. I mean, there's all this stuff you can't do if you're not here legally. So, you know, it's an interesting issue because there's a huge amount of disagreement just among various authorities in terms of what the actual numbers of populations here in Hawaii are. And, you know, even when you do the census, this population, if they're Tongan and they're not here legally, they're not going to answer that on the census. This is one reason why very frequently Tongans will answer. If they're actually asked by someone who's official, they'll say they're Samoan. They know that the population here doesn't know the difference. And if they're Samoan, everyone's going to think they're from American Samoa and they're legal. So there's not going to be any questions raised. So, you know, it's just part of this very sort of complex, they're a very complicated group in many ways that gets sort of rolled into this stereotype of, you know, the Samoan, which is totally not accurate. If we go back to that chart near the beginning of the semester, I had that chart, which the sort of pink-red chart, which had basically your Calvinist value on one side and the Hawaiian values on the other. Not surprisingly, since they're from Polynesia also, you find the Samoans and Tongans pretty much are a one-to-one correlation with that Hawaiian side of that value system. And one of the things that's really important to remember, given the stereotyping, which is that, you know, Samoan and Tongans are not, they're more interested in other things, especially family ties and, say, education. The reality is those groups value education hugely. Being educated is a huge status in Samoan and Tongan societies. So education on one hand is something they value greatly, which is one reason why they frequently send kids up here to go to school. They know the education system is better than back home, and they want their kids to get a good education and as much education as possible. The problem you get into, and this is true of a lot of groups here, it's just these groups are here now in terms of new, is that this education then competes with the fact that the group's more important than the individual. So if you've got a kid who's, for example, going to Chaminade, and so they're, you know, they're working very hard to, you know, pay back, you know, or pay the part of their tuition. They've got a, you know, Pell Grant or something to pay part of the tuition. But if all of a sudden their auntie comes up and she's ill and she needs medical treatment here, the family's going to expect that student to pretty much drop what they're doing at Chaminade and help family. So it's family first, individual second. And because the way the educational system isn't really that compelling in neither Tonga nor in American Samoa, families don't really apparently seem to really understand the amount of commitment it takes to get through school. So what happens is, on one hand, they want folks like your age group to be successful, and they'll support you all the way. On the other hand, if there's family issues, it's family first, then you go back to school. And there's not a really good grasp of the fact that school's on a schedule, and, you know, there's times where things have to be done and you can't just postpone them and do them later. Again, because like Hawaiians, these are task-based societies. They're not time-based societies. And again, because you have this very close contact between the population here and the population back in Samoa or Tonga, they have the ability basically to manipulate the individual here to a great extent, to sort of micromanage them. That couldn't have been done, say, 100 years ago when you had to deal with a letter. So this puts an enormous amount of stress on individuals up here. They're expected to care for family. The group's more important than they are as individuals. You have, pretty strict gender roles in a lot of ways, typical of most of Polynesia. But you've also got this value of education. The two can get very contradictory, as I think I mentioned with my office mate over at UH. They can get very, very contradictory when the family doesn't make allowances for the fact that, well, if you want education, the family has to cut you, X amount of slack to get stuff done. This is one of the things you really see with Samoan and Tongan students. And I used to work with a bunch of them over at UH when I first started over there. Where they're different from the groups that we've had before. And this is actually going to be also very similar with Micronesians. It's pretty much the same for both these areas. One is that nurturing roles are held in generations. Now, this was also true of Hawaiian society, but it's changed a little bit because you have to remember folks that are ethnically Hawaiian in the 21st century have had basically, 100-something plus years of assimilation in one way, shape, or form to American/Calvinist values. So there's more of a recognition of the fact that, the role of father and mother, for example, even if the family thinks that siblings should have more say about stuff, they understand or realize that the general population here sees father and mother as rearing kids. For Samoans, Tongans, and for Micronesians, almost all of that is done in the same generation, which I mentioned before, because that's also true of Chinese. So in that situation, what you're going to find is if you're a Samoan student here at Chaminade and you're a sophomore, and all of a sudden your family sends up some of your younger siblings to go to high school, say, you're expected to care for them in the same way that a parent would. In fact, the parents would assume that if you were back home, you'd be doing most of the caring anyways. They wouldn't. So generations are sort of like layer cakes. They don't really interact vertically very much. They pretty much do their own thing. And this, again, is another pressure for older siblings here in Hawaii, if they're trying to, adapt or whatever, is they're expected to basically take on the parenting roles for their younger relatives in the same generation, which is yet another layer of issues. And this is one that gets, given the bureaucracy, especially like DOE and other agencies in the 21st century, which are totally based on the Anglo-American idea of the nuclear family. The education system, for example, in social services, especially DSSH, social services and housing, they have absolutely no tolerance for an older sibling taking care of younger siblings and the parents being somewhere else or working all the time. Their attitude is the role of parents is to take care of their kids. And if they don't, then they'll send in social service agencies and child protective folks and take the kids away from the parents. So what you have here is that mainland stereotype of the nuclear family is in direct conflict with the way that both Polynesians and Micronesians rear their children. And so along with everything else, then you've got this huge source of conflict, or where you sort of have to hide who's taking care of the kids type stuff. I see this a lot at the schools we work with at Jared Intermediate, especially this idea of who are the nurturing figures. These folks, like the other folks in the earlier centuries, coming from a rural world. So I think I mentioned last time, they do not have a lot of experience, or almost no experience, with an urban setting, especially like Honolulu, which is probably one reason why Tongans in large numbers gravitated to Maui. It was a little closer, relatively speaking, to the world they were familiar with. But being Samoan and ending up in Kalihi, for example, I can't imagine what that would be like. It'd be like moving to Mars and living with aliens. There's so little there that you're familiar with, and there's so much that you're not familiar with. Little things like, for example, if you're walking by someone's house, this was a classic stereotype of the 90s with Samoans and Tongans, that they'd, quote, steal mangoes from the neighbor's trees. Back in the rural areas, if there's a tree and it's got fruit and no one's using it, and they're falling on the ground and going rotten, then of course you're going to go take them. In the same way that if your tree's got that, you expect your neighbors to take yours. It's very much a share collective world. Here, of course, what you're doing is you're trespassing on someone else's property. So they're coming from a world mindset, and again, because there's not a lot of exposure to the outside world outside of media. They don't really understand almost any of the nuances of sort of modern American society in the 21st century. It's probably actually easier in some ways if they move to the mainland United States, because the minute they land and end up in some place like Bakersfield or Fresno, they have absolutely no doubt that they're entirely in a different world. Here in Hawaii, it's very complicated. If you move into some place like Laie, and there's a lot of Samoans and Tongans around, and to superficially look similar, then I think maybe you get lulled into the fact that it really isn't that different until you end up in trouble or someone starts dissing on you or something. So here's probably actually in some ways weirdly more difficult, simply because there's an assumption on the part of both Polynesians and Micronesians that Hawaii is a much more sort of accepting place and an easier place to sort of adjust to life outside of the home territory, which I would disagree with entirely. Again, as I mentioned last time, you only have partial assimilation because media, especially social media and modern communications, allows you to pretend that you're still home. It allows you to interact with relatives so you don't feel the need to interact with your neighbors or people around you to the same extent, especially if those folks speak a different language or they use English only, and they expect you to, so there's more pressure on you. So it's really easy to go to your phone and you can speak Tongan to your relatives back in Tonga or somewhere else, and you can sort of ignore the irritations of a world around you which doesn't fit what you want. So I would argue that in many ways, digital media is an escape for Pacific Islanders. It allows them to sort of pretend they're not in the world they're actually in. And of course, that's an incredibly dangerous thing because sooner or later that world's going to show up because it's reality. You know, and you see this, you know, just with this contact at home, the idea that you can go home, that folks from home can come here, you know, this easy interaction, well, till COVID showed up. So, you know, that makes the adjustment to life here much more superficial. It's not the calculated circular migration that you see with Filipinos, which it actually is pretty pragmatic and very calculated, and I think much more realistic in terms of here. For Polynesians and Micronesians, Hawaii has got sort of a weird set of stereotypic images in terms of what it offers, and I think in that regard they find themselves, I don't know if I'd call it a trap, but life ends up here being a lot more difficult than maybe it would if they were a little more, if the whole family were more realistic about what life here in Hawaii is like. Okay, so let's segue to the next group, since some of you actually already wrote on the Micronesians. Micronesians, yeah, let's see, let's switch over here so I can give you a visual here. It's like where to start. When you're looking at Micronesians, first thing to remember is like the only thing I can think of that's actually a close parallel, in fact, you could argue the first part of the 20th century, it's very close, would be Filipinos. The Philippines is a separate country, and it has what it's trying to call as a national identity, which is basically Tagalog culture and Tagalog values. But as we've gone through a couple of weeks ago, it's an incredibly complicated place with totally different languages, totally different cultures, just happen to be in the same clump of islands. Well, if you look at Micronesia, the first thing to remember is there's no such thing as Micronesian. There's Nicarabas, there's Marshallese, there's FSM Chukis and the other groups in FSM like Pohnpeian, Kosraean. There's the Chamorros in Guam, and then there's of course Guamanians who are different than Chamorros, and then there's of course Balauans. So you've got these very different cultures. They have almost not really a lot in common. There's some common parallels or threads that go through them. The Pacific Island class, we spent a lot more time. They were actually settled by different populations. Nicarabati, for example, and most Marshallese, it looks like the populations came up from Polynesia. In the western area, especially Guam and FSM, it looks like the populations came up from a combination of Polynesia and Melanesia. In the far west, Palau and to a certain extent Chamorros, a lot of the settlement actually came from the Philippines. And if you look at it, basically here's Kiribati here, here's the Marshalls here. Here's the FSM, so that'd be Palau, I'm sorry, that'd be Pohnpei, Kosrae, Chuk and that other areas. Here's Palau, and here's Guam and the Northern Marianas, and here's the Philippines. So this basically stretches all the way from Southeast Asia to, if you're looking at Kiribati, just south of Hawaii. So it's an absolutely enormous area. Now the second thing to remember, and we'll actually, we'll do Marshall since it's, Marshall's a little bit of a striking exaggeration, but not too much. Jalawi's a good place to do this. Okay. Now, if you think about this compared to every place else we've looked at, there's one thing that should be really striking. What's really striking about this? This is one of the larger atolls, Jalawi. What's missing? This is a Thursday morning question, so don't work on it too hard.
I would say land.
You got it. Yeah, yeah. Score 10 points on that one. Yeah. Think about that. Folks, this is all you got. You're basically on a sandbar on a reef. Now you've got this huge atoll, which is what makes most of Micronesia incredibly successful in terms of human population, is basically they're maritime. To a certain extent, these folks live on ships that don't move. Now, Marshall's is one of the most striking of these simply because, you know, here's your capillary and then here's marginal. You think about it, you know, you'd have no reason to have a car. In a moped going slow, you could be right across here in 30 seconds, you know, or a minute. These are incredibly small pieces of real estate surrounded by huge, huge amounts of water, okay? So even if we go into the areas that are a little larger, like Pohnpei, which is one of the larger islands in much of Micronesia, you're still talking about a staggeringly small piece of real estate, relatively speaking. So these are incredibly small land areas. They're invariably surrounded by absolutely superb, huge reef systems, which is why people can live on them. But these are by any definition of any, you know, sort of conceptual pattern, these are populations that are basically maritime. Compared to this, Samoa is absolutely huge. The Hawaiian Islands have more, in fact, the big island of Hawaii has more land area than all of Micronesia. So, you know, compared to the Hawaiian Islands, it's not even, it ain't even. I mean, the biggest player in the game is Guam. That's about, I can remember, so someone actually figured out once, I think it's like 1/3 the size of Oahu or something like that. I mean, I can never remember exactly. It's, you know, relatively, and it's the big player, and it's tiny. So what you've got are incredibly small pieces of real estate surrounded by the whole Central Pacific Ocean. So that's the first thing to remember, is when you talk about this being one thing, when people talk about Micronesians, that's like if you're on the mainland, it's just someone who grew up in a Mexican neighborhood. That's when it's like someone uses the word Latinos in the mainland. You know, if you're coming from a Mexican neighborhood, you don't see that you necessarily have a lot in common with people who come from Chile or Argentina or Peru or Guatemala. But to the Americans, you're Latinos. In the same way, if most of you moved to the mainland, you'd be called Asian. Though, you know, if you're Chinese, Japanese, Korean, etc., then, you know, you don't, that's not a package you buy here because we don't use that. We use the separate groups. But for this population that's moved in here in the 21st century, we call them all Micronesian. Now that causes a huge amount of trouble, just the least of all. For example, I know one of my relatives works with a judicial system. You know, if someone gets arrested and they're in court and they've got to testify or they're a witness, and they come from the marshals, and then so their native language is getting Marshallese, you can't bring in a translator that speaks Pohnpeian, because, you know, that's like someone coming in to translate Chinese when they speak Japanese. So these are incredibly complicated groups, and this means, among other things, and especially, for example, in Department of Education, since they almost invariably go to public schools, you can imagine the nightmare you've got if you're trying to figure out how do you take folks that are basically, say, Kiribati speakers. How do you do English as a second language that's Kiribati specific, but the kid sitting next to him is from the Marshalls, and the kid sitting next to them is from Chuuk, and the kid sitting next to them is from Saipan, and the kid sitting next to them is from Palau. You know, you need 5 sets of materials to get all those kids up to speed to speaking English and being able to work from their home language to become competent English speakers. And you can't just say, oh, you guys all speak Micronesian, so here's your Micronesian text. There's no such thing as a Micronesian text. So these folks are not part of a group. They're part of a region of the world, but it's very much like the word Latinos is in the US mainland, where basically it means anyone south of the American border who grew up in some place where they spoke Spanish, but it has nothing to do with who the people actually are. And trust me, there's absolutely nothing in common between Zapotec or Azteca and folks from Chile, except that they all grew up speaking Spanish because the Spanish controlled them for 300, 400 years. That's the same thing with Micronesia. It's a totally bad idea to label it that way because it sort of assumes there's some continuity and there's some patterns that are the same. And at least one or two, you actually brought this up in your critical thinking papers about the fact that this is, one of the really bad ideas is when you start calling these guys a thing. Now, of course, the irony is it's not just here. That's actually the federal government that considers them a thing. So this is actually U.S. government policy, is to see Micronesia as a package deal, with the exception of Guam, who is an unincorporated territory, just like American Samoa. But the Northern Marianas, don't get me started on that because I've never quite figured out what the relationship is this week with the Northern Marianas, who are actually more tied into what you might call the classic Micronesian role as far as the United States is concerned. So it's U.S. government policy in Washington, D.C. is everyone in this area is part of a package. And I don't know if we'll have time in this class, but that creates an enormous amount of confusion and problems at, say, the state level. So very quickly, if we go through these groups, what happens is, as again, Guam's a U.S. territory taken in 1898 when the Americans, beat the Spanish. Same time they take the Philippines for the same reason. And so the rest of this area is actually, with one or two little island exceptions, the rest of this area actually is under German control. In World War I, the Japanese take them from the Germans. So the vast majority of Micronesia was under Japanese control till 1944, 1945. Some of the islands were invaded and taken over by the Americans. But the vast majority of the islands of Micronesia weren't even taken over by the Americans. The Americans just bypassed the Japanese, and there's terrible stories of cannibalism and starvation and stuff, of literally tens of thousands of Japanese troops being stuck on small islands as the Americans made sure that no one could come to them. So all that was left for was the Japanese, of course, the poor locals who just happened to be unfortunate on that same island. And there were a lot of cases of Japanese just wiping out the local population because they basically were competing for food. And at least in a few cases in the central Micronesian area, using them as food. So this is some of the most brutal parts of World War II though it wasn't necessarily actual battles. So at the end of World War II, the United States takes over all of Micronesia. The Americans weren't sure what they were going to do with it, but they wanted to make sure that no one else got it. Because World War II this part of the World War II had been an absolute nightmare for them. And so they wanted to make sure this was never going to happen again. So the Americans took over Micronesia simply because they wanted to use it almost like you'd use an airbag. They wanted to make sure that if they had it, it wasn't going to come back to haunt them if someone else started messing around. And so they take over Micronesia, but they're not interested in the people. They're not interested in land. They're not interested in the resources. They just, for geopolitical, largely military reasons, they want to make sure no one else has the place. Now, if you think about it, that's a very different view than they had of Hawaii. Hawaii was useful. Hawaii had Pearl Harbor. Hawaii had some resources. They had sugar plantations, So Hawaii was a good idea. Guam, to a certain extent, was a good idea. It had a big military base. It's got a good position, etc. But if you're in the Marshalls or Chuuk or something like that, after 1945, when the Americans show up, they really don't give a rat's ass because, they just took you because you visualize if you take something because you don't want someone else to have it, possession is all you're interested in. You're not interested in the people or what you're going to do or improving their life or anything. It's just possession. And so what happens is right into the 1970s, this whole area of the Pacific was controlled by the US Navy. It should have been controlled by the State Department. Or if they were going to make it into territories, it would have been controlled by the Interior Department, the way that Guam and Samoa, American Samoa are. But they're not. These were never incorporated into the United States. In fact, the mandate from the United Nations when they let the United States take this area over is the United States was supposed to prepare the Micronesian regions for independence by 1951. So the first stereotype was Americans rescued the Micronesians from the Japanese, and there's a certain amount of truth in that. And then the second was they were supposed to prepare them for independence. But of course, the United States was not interested in spending any money and had no interest in Micronesia, so they didn't do anything. The only place they did something in a sad way was realizing that because this area is really empty, if you really wanted to, this was a great place to test nuclear weapons, since they'd already had a huge number of fiascos in New Mexico and then later in Nevada, where they actually had radioactive bomb clouds go over Las Vegas. So at that point, they realized they really had to find a place that was far enough away from civilizations, they thought, that they could blow stuff up and there wouldn't be any consequences. And of course, given their lack of disinterest in the people in this area, some light bulb went off in someone's head and they said, hey, wait, why don't we use one or two of the islands in the Marshalls since they ain't near nothing? And we'll just blow them puppies up till the cows come home and we can have a good old time watching how this stuff works. Now you have to remember, part of this was simply the fact that no one knew how nuclear weapons worked. there was a bunch of theory, but no one had ever actually tried the buggers till they launched them on the Japanese. So things like radioactivity, radioactive clouds, gases, emissions, all that type of stuff. Well, they only found that out when I lit the buggers off. So they'd already had problems with that in Nevada, which was the big disaster, at least in the mainland U.S. They were going to try it at Kaho'olawe, but fortunately, cooler heads prevailed on that one. And so they decided they needed a place further away, so it became the Marshalls. Having said that, one of the stereotypes that you find even with Micronesians is the argument, oh, they did nuclear testing in Micronesia. No, 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 no. They did nuclear testing in the Marshalls. If you were in Palau or Pohnpei or Guam or something like that, your chances of getting hit by radiation was actually less than it was from Russian testing in Siberia. So the Micronesian region was not subject to nuclear testing. The Marshallese were, and legitimately are still very pissed off about that and constantly have demanded and got at least some reparations from the United States for the massive number of nuclear tests that were done here. And I should point out that we tend to forget about this, but the British, even though Australia was an independent country, the British talked the Australians into letting them light off nuclear weapons here in the center part of Australia. And a number of Aboriginal populations were killed by British nuclear testing there. And of course, the French were doing nuclear testing right into the 21st century in French Polynesia. So, dissing on the Americans is entirely legit, but that's a Marshallese prerogative. It's not a Micronesian prerogative. And it was not unique. The testing, the United States testing stopped long before the French finished testing. And the British testing went on to almost the same period as the Americans, which is even weirder because, Australia's a separate country. And I never did figure out why the Australians would let the Brits light off nuclear weapons on their property when the British have islands in the Pacific and other parts of the world that could have done stuff. So go figure. You have to ask the Aussies about that. I've never figured it out. So this population basically ends up under U.S. control. And so it's everything from here all the way to here. Now, what that means is by the 1960s, 1970s, when the world is decolonizing, Vietnam, South Vietnam, which was sort of the American-sponsored thing, originally French and the Americans, that collapses, it becomes the country of Vietnam. Southeast Asia, which was largely Dutch-controlled, they try to take it back after World War II. There's a brutal war, and the end of that is the country of Indonesia. The Southeast Asian countries, Malaysia, Cambodia, Laos, all these countries that had been under British or French control get their independence. So the world was becoming independent. And the United States was a big pusher for that, because you have to remember, this is the period of the Cold War. This is when you've got the United States on one hand and the sort of stereotypic communist countries, and I use that in quotes since they were dictatorships, they weren't communist, but that would be the combination of both the Soviet Union and People's Republic of China. So these were seen as the two, global superpowers going after each other. And part of the American posturing during the Cold War era was the fact that the world had to become independent and people had to be able to make their own decisions about their own government. So the United States wanted everyone to decolonize. Now, of course, what that meant is that by the 1970s, that became very embarrassing because the United States had this huge chunk of the Pacific, which wasn't even territories, but they still ran, and it was now 20 years after they'd said they were going to give the place independence. And so not surprisingly, everyone starts, going from the United Nations, sort of like raising their hand in the back of the class and saying, excuse me, sir, what the hell are you guys doing? If you want us to get rid of our colonies, then what the hell are you guys up to? And so eventually the United States sort of had to, pay the bar tab, as it were. So in that context, what they did is they came up, but they still wanted to make sure that no one else had access to Micronesia. So the geopolitical fears in the United States never changed, and they're still true in 2020. Having said that, by the 1970s, you just couldn't string these guys on and just sort of screw around and do nothing, which they'd done. They've basically been treating them as sort of like a de facto naval military bases. And so in this case, what they do is they come up with this weird thing called the Compact of Free Association, which if you actually know anything about American English, it's a really weird set of words. Compact means agreement, free means by choice, and then association means the same as compact. So it was classic State Department PR. And what they did is they went to these different places, like, for example, the place that fought back the most would be Palau. So they go to the folks here and they basically say, okay, here's the deal. What we're going to do is we don't want you talking to anyone that you shouldn't talk to, which by now is also Indonesia and other places. So we're gonna pay you millions and millions of dollars a year. Okay, we're basically gonna provide like a version of foreign aid. We're gonna make you guys independent, but You're only going to get the money if you agree to the following rules. One, you do not talk to any foreign governments. We talk for you. So remember these, on one hand, it's supposed to be an independent country. Two, we reserve the right to take over any and all of your islands at any point we want to without asking you in advance. Three is you will not talk to any other country in terms of defense or anything like that. We're in charge of anything to do with policing your waters or anything else around you. If you do that, we'll give you, $40 million a year. And since there were no other players, you didn't have any choice. Palau fought for a while, but finally they said, okay, fine, we'll do it. Northern Marianas did the same thing. FSM did the same thing. Marshall and Kiribati did the same thing. These are the compacts of free association. At that point, these places technically became independent. They have seats in the United Nations. But if you think about it, what that means is they're sitting in the United Nations. Their delegates can literally not get up and go talk to the Chinese guy down the road. The Americans will literally get in between and stop and say, no, you don't talk to the other guys. You want something, you ask us, we'll talk to the Chinese. And that was the deal. If you breach that, then we're going to do two things. One is we're going to cut the money, so you have no money coming in because you guys don't have anything to sell. And secondly, we might just take over your entire country, which we can do because that was part of the agreement. So that's the Compact of Free Association. Now, what they got out of it besides the money, and this is the bizarre part, is the US government told these regions that basically now you're going to be treated as the same as US military dependents. So it's the same as if you married US service personnel. So this means you have access to military facilities in terms of care, et cetera, et cetera. And what this also meant is you could then travel to the United States with very little restrictions in the same way that military dependents could. So if you think of it, it's sort of like a modern version of the picture bride thing. And so that was the setup. It was convenient to the US government in a global sense because it's not like a large number of Micronesians are going to go to Washington, D.C. So there's no skin off of their nose. There's no skin off of the mainland United States. The populations are small and they're not particularly relevant to the mainland. And it got rid of a huge embarrassing political situation vis-a-vis the rest of the planet and American attitudes. It also then meant that you now sort of solved the problem because you still had all these folks on a very short string. Because in the period from 1950 on, the only way that anything got into these islands, from food to medical services to education, was through first the US military and then later the sort of the Interior Department thing. So at that point, the United States basically had built these into baby versions of base housing, for lack of a better term. They even had, for example, back in the 70s and 80s, they even had the not only food stamps, but the food assistance programs, like frozen chicken and cheese and stuff like that. None of which, of course, cheese, they'd never seen cheese in Micronesia. But by the 1970s and 80s, they were used to eating American, pretty much junk food. Why? Because the US Navy set them up as base housing. There was no difference between base housing in Wahiawa and what you'd find in the Marshalls at Majuro or in Chuuk or someplace like that. The Navy just had, one size fits all. And then the United States saw no reason to change that. Now, where this becomes an enormous issue for Hawaii, and also even more so for Guam, is that since there's no way to make any money, and the education systems were stunningly bad in these areas, again, because the United States didn't spend any time or effort trying to make them any better. Because if you want to give your kids an education, if you need medical assistance, if you need anything, you're not going to find it in Micronesia. First shot is Guam. If you can't find it on Guam, then your next shot is Hawaii. If you can't find it there, then theoretically the mainland, but that becomes a lot more complicated because ironically you have much less military presence in the US mainland. So it's a lot harder to get access to those services that were promised by the US government because they were promised through the Department of Defense. And so this is one reason why if you work at some place like Tripler, you find tons of Micronesians showing up. Entirely legitimately, because they're there because that's the agreement that their country has with the United States at the federal level. Now, because that's a federal agreement, the US government provides almost no assistance to the state of Hawaii for Micronesians in the state of Hawaii because the federal attitude is tough. So state of Hawaii, very legitimately, Department of Education points out that Micronesians cost them millions and millions of dollars a year in terms of special education needs, simply because you have to have translators, you need to build, curriculum that has, English second language stuff that's appropriate to a particular area. And the federal government provides no money for any of that. the Hawaii taxpayer, or if you're on Guam, the Guamanian taxpayers have to provide those services, because the federal government, once they gave these folks not citizenship, it gave them sort of like green card family status, they just walked from it. And this is a huge bone of contention both on Guam and in Hawaii, is that the Micronesian populations are an enormous drain on resources that the federal government stuck on these islands, on our islands, and on Guam especially, without any sort of interest in compensating the islands for them. And Guam, of course, even is more sensitive to this because they get swamped by the number of folks, especially from FSM and stuff that end up at Guam, because they legitimately need services. Guam's the logical place to go. It's part of Micronesia. Da, 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 da. So when you're looking at the stress factor of Micronesians in Hawaii and Micronesians in Guam, there's very little difference between the two. You find that a lot of this has been intentionally generated by the federal government. It's not Micronesians or Micronesian attitudes or their behavior or anything like that. And in a weird way, it's actually not, I would argue in some ways, it's actually not a fault of the local population. It's the fact that the federal government set up a situation that was guaranteed to be a failure and a huge source of conflict and friction, and then just basically has walked from the whole thing and said, see you guys next month, with no attempt and no interest in Washington, especially in Congress, to do anything about it. Every year, the state government at all sorts of different levels lobbies all the different federal agencies, especially the Federal Department of Education, for monies to support the needs of Micronesian students, for like counseling services, everything. If you think about it, if you've got a school counselor, they have to speak 5 Micronesian languages if they're going to be a Jared Intermediate, because they're going to find populations from all 5 of those regions at that school. You're not going to find counselors with that skill set of being professionally trained counselors with those language specialties. Not unless you pay them a lot of money, or you actually train people at places like Chaminade or UH to do that. And that takes federal funds, and the feds won't put a penny. So this population was set up. I can't think of a better way to phrase it. They were totally set up. Once the federal government set them up, then the federal government figured it really didn't have to improve the services in the islands, because if they didn't like the services in the islands, then they could go to Guam or Hawaii. So at that point, the federal government washed its hands of these areas. There's been some absolutely scathing audits. You can probably find the one for FSM and the Marshals, and it's actually a public document, where the GSO, the General Accounting, or GAO, the General Accounting Office, did an audit of the U.S. money spent in these parts of Micronesia, and basically found that 70% of the money disappears. No one knows where it goes. Our former president, in fact, the last 2 presidents have all gone to our parts of Micronesia. That's why we've got the problem in the program in Shook right now. And they went to the public schools, and the public schools didn't have tables, they didn't have chairs, they had no textbooks. Almost none of the teachers were actually qualified to teach. And they've been under federal government control of the United States since 1946. And this was in 10 years ago. So, the United States has just done a stereotype of how you can mismanage a region or a group of people over just because you don't give a crap. That's the feds. And so what happens is everyone's left picking up the pieces. The Marshallese, the Kitabasis, the Balawans, all the rest of these groups are trying to figure out how to make a living in the 21st century. When on one hand, the United States says, oh, we gave you $40 million, which I think is what the yearly amount is for the Marshals, but no one knows where 70 or 80% of the money goes. Some folks are obviously doing really well out of it, but the money does not go down to the population. Healthcare services in the Micronesia are stunningly bad. It's got the highest rates of TB, all sorts of stuff in Micronesia. It's actually much worse than areas of sub-Saharan Africa that are stereotypic as being really bad, deadly third world regions. Much of Micronesia is actually a lot worse in terms of health services and in terms of the health of the population, which means you've got an even more large part of the population that has to go to Hawaii or Guam for minimal health services. Much of Micronesia, for example, there's no dialysis machines. I mean, since you've got some of the highest rates of diabetes in the world, what do? Well, you can't stay home, you're going to die. So this is an area that doesn't fit any of the parameters we've had before. It's not like Polynesia, where it's sort of an economic thing. For much of Micronesia, you go to Guam or Hawaii, or you just stay on a small island with all intents and purposes, no future unless somehow you're tied into the families and have the money because they're in the government, which is where the US money tends to sort of fizzle out. So a large part of the populations are almost entirely destitute, except for what they can provide in services. One of the other aspects that occurs, and this is especially true in the marshes, which is probably the most striking of these, is that when the US government set up control post-World War II, this is very different. The Japanese just sort of left the place alone. They turned into military bases, but they didn't really bother the local population per se. So for example, the most famous would be Kwajalein, which is where the huge American military bases, that's where they fire the missiles to from Barking Sands. In fact, they just fired another one, I think, a couple of days ago. So if you're looking at this, what happened is what they do is, since this is where the big American military base was, down here, is this becomes a miniature version of Schofield. So, you know, you got everything from a rec center to a pond to a pool to the whole 9 yards. And the United States pays, I can't remember how millions of dollars a year to the Marshallese government to basically rent Kwajalein. The vast majority of the workforce actually is over here. Let's see, I can remember where Ubai is, somewhere up in here. I can't remember. The main part of the workforce lives in another part of the lagoon, and they live in very much third world situations. And because the Americans basically limited their access to resources to the areas they were really interested in. If you wanted dental care, minimal mental, medical care, anything like that, good education, you had to be near the American bases, which meant that huge parts of the population moved from the islands they were actually from, and the rest of them in the Marshallese chain, to live in these very compressed areas that only had a few people on them before, because that was the closest to the Americans, and the Americans were where the money and the resources were. So what happens is you end up with artificially huge populations on incredibly small pieces of real estate. While there's large numbers of islands that actually had people till 100 years ago, which are totally empty. And this creates a whole mess of social stress, because Micronesian populations were designed to be spread over, over a lot of islands with not very many people. And you suddenly pack them into pretty much urban settings. I think it's about here. I can't find it. I never can find it, but I don't know why. Here we can see this here. So what you get here is this is part of an old military base. The military still runs part of this, obviously, but you got a local population that's pretty much squished on there, that normally would have been on a total of maybe 6 or 10 different islands, that now, just because of their access or availability to resources, yeah, here you go right here. So this is the Micronesian population that would have been on maybe 6 or 12 islands. To be close to the salaries, to be close to what the Americans have, they all live in very compressed, very substandard housing for much of it by. There's power, I think, 2 or 3 days of the year, of the week. The sewage system is pretty much non-existent. It's mind-blowing what they have to live with. And the Americans set that up. The Americans didn't tell them move to here. But if you want access to what the Americans have here, you've got to be next to them, which means that you'll suffer with a really substandard living standard here, so that you have access to the Americans. And that's how the Americans set up Micronesia. They didn't even plan it. They just didn't care, which is in some ways probably the most depressing aspect of the Micronesian situation. It was just allowed to happen because there was no one going, wait, don't we owe something to these people? We're supposedly setting them up for independence, and instead we set them up to fail. So when you're looking at Micronesians here in Hawaii, you have to remember it's within this context. They're the second, maybe third, maybe fourth generation of folks that grew up in a situation like this. It's entirely artificial compared to their cultural backgrounds, that there's no relationship to what they thought they might get in the world. Geez, can we actually go into Google Earth? How many bars are? No, I didn't think so. And yet that's the world you grow up in. So your educational system is poor, which is ironic because you've got very poor schools here, and yet, of course, a couple of miles to the south, you've got classic American schools with teachers imported from Hawaii or the US mainland to teach the military dependent kids in a classic situation. So you go from a tour of duty in Schofield, you maybe go over here for a couple of years, and then you go somewhere else. So this is a classic American military base. It's got all the amenities and everything that you'd normally expect, because that's, that's the way the place works. So you can have a park, you can have all that stuff. And what the Micronesians have is, to all intents and purposes, basically, to all intents for none of that stuff. So it's not to belittle the folks that are stuck on Kwajalein, because if you talk to folks that have been there, they oftentimes are shocked at if they ever go to Abai, to realize what the folks that work on the base are actually what they actually live in. But I think very few folks, even the folks that live here, understand what the folks on the other islands put up with. And that was all designed by intentional neglect on the part of the U.S. government. So what you deal with in Hawaii when you're dealing with folks from the Micronesian region is the fallout, if you would, of absolutely, I'm not even sure I would call it failed government policies, because the government didn't have a policy, just didn't give a shit. And we in Guam pick up the pieces. So in this regard, it's totally different than Polynesians, because Micronesian societies do not have the same value system as Polynesian societies do. They're very much, traditionally, most Micronesian regions were matrilineal. So women were the most powerful group. Women controlled property. Men were pretty much limited to the ocean. So women could divorce men if they felt that the guy wasn't providing enough services for the family. So, they were in a situation where we had female dominance and a female structured society. But of course, the problem is when the US Navy comes in, well, the Japanese, for example, in the early half of the 20th century, the Germans before that, of course, when the Americans come in, they come in from male dominated societies. On one hand, American society might have been changing by the 50s, 60s a little bit, but the US military wasn't. So the folks that are running Micronesia for over a century basically just constantly reiterate women, their positions in the home, and they should keep their mouth shut, and guys should be in control and authority. Well, in Micronesia, that just completely changed your social value system where men were supposed to keep their mouth shut and women were in authority. It's a little different with the Chamorros in Guam, because of course they had the Spanish pounding them for a couple of hundred years. So they were, to a certain extent, slightly more adaptive. But even today, if you're familiar with Chamorros, you notice that women in Chamorro society have much more power than they do in other areas of Spanish control, which reflects, again, this traditional matrilineal system. Now, not surprisingly, what happens then is both Guam, but especially Hawaii, even more so than for Polynesians, gets seen as the golden goose. If the family needs services, if the family needs health services, if the family needs to give their kids a decent education, not a great education, but even just a decent education. The worst public school in Hawaii is better than almost any of the public schools in much of Micronesia. And the only decent schools in much of Micronesia are actually the private schools, some of them Catholic, which are the ones we're affiliated with. So, if you've got a kid who's even 6, 7 years old in some place like the Marshalls, you desperately want to send that kid to Hawaii, or if they can't get to Guam, to come to Hawaii to go to school, just because they know they'll get a good education. They're not allowed to send their kids to Kwajalein. So Micronesian kids are not allowed, ironically, to enter into the base educational systems on the US bases in Micronesia. Even though they're technically labeled as sort of in the same category as military dependents, that doesn't give them access to the military facilities in Micronesia. They're sent to Guam or Hawaii for that. You can just see it's a recipe for a mess, to put it mildly. So what you end up with is two things. So that on one thing, like Polynesia, these are remittance economies. You desperately send people out for the purpose of sending money back home. But unlike Polynesia, what you don't have is, you're missing two things. One is you don't have a conservative, stable culture. On the Micronesian regions, the Germans, but especially the Japanese came in, they tried to change things. The Americans came in and just totally changed everything. The American template is you guys should look like part of a suburb of Detroit. So there was no interest in traditional society or culture, no interest in traditional values. There was none of this that you get, for example, with the British and the Americans and stuff and Germans in Polynesia, where there was this idea of preserving aspects of Polynesian cultures because they were, worth something. The American attitude towards Micronesian cultures, they weren't worth anything. That's why you can use part of Micronesia as a bombing range. It doesn't bother you at all. And so in that situation, you don't have an idea of a home culture which is stable and really coherent and grounded in, 100 years of tradition. There's no Micronesian equivalent to Fa Samoa. You have societies that's gone through enormous amount of change at home. So when folks are coming here, they don't have in many cases a real grounded concept of a sort of a coherent, solid, traditional cultural pattern, which they can then sort of evaluate vis-a-vis assimilation to Hawaii. They're in many cases, especially for the group under 40 years of age, they're just sort of lost. And so they come here and they're trying to adapt to Hawaii. But in many ways, it's easier to assimilate to a society if you have a strong sense of who you were prior to moving to that place. I would argue in many ways it's much more difficult to assimilate to a new place if you don't really have a strong sense of who you were in the other place. So what happens is you end up with remittance economies, but very, very, very different types of remittance economies, because for a large part of the population of Micronesia, it's not that they want to leave home, but given the reality of the 21st century in much of Micronesia, realistic families figure the only way for the family to ever become successful is get their ass out. Because again of this idea of the relationship with the federal government, because you have to remember federal services in most of the US mainland for military related things are actually quite small, because the federal impact in terms of the Department of Defense, especially on the West Coast, is really tiny. And since Micronesians are basically linked to the federal government and the DoD, it makes it very difficult for them to, for example, copy Polynesians and move to someplace like Bakersfield or Fresno or something like that. You don't have military hospitals around there. They don't have access to the federal facilities because there aren't federal facilities. So the very situation the federal government set up, I don't think the federal government was smart enough to do it intentionally, but it pretty much drove them to Guam, which of course has huge military bases, and Hawaii, which has absolutely enormous military bases. So it sort of drove them there and kept them away from the mainland United States, because it was just very difficult for them, still is, to access what they've been promised on the US mainland. So unlike Samoans or Tongans, and of course they don't have access to the rest of the world, so they're not going to be able to go to New Zealand, not going to be able to go somewhere else. They're pretty much trapped. Well, trapped isn't a good word. The only viable options are two. Both those areas require advanced education. In Guam, it's either you work for the military or the hotel, tourism industry. So it's pretty much like here, a smaller scale, but the services are also very limited. Cost of living is high. Space is much more limited on Guam than it is here in Hawaii. So if you end up with a large number of Micronesians, they're competing with everyone on Guam for jobs and everything else, just like they do here. And because they don't have a particular good skill set and their education level is much lower than you're going to find from Polynesia, not surprisingly, huge numbers of them are going to fall through the gaps because they really don't have anything that makes them even viably competitive in a minimal way to the other populations. So when you're looking at the stereotypes of Micronesians here, there's a whole mess of complex reasons why those stereotypes exist, though it's important to understand that from one region to the next, they're different stereotypes in the sense that they're different people. The stereotypes are pretty much the same for Micronesians here, and some of you actually looked at that in your critical thinking papers. But the populations aren't a package deal. Sadly, they're a package deal in the sense that the federal government treats them that way, which means the state of Hawaii treats them that way. So, it's an absolute zoo. I've got some list of the changes, given the fact the semester is shrinking really fast. I don't have time to get into the idea, but basically in traditional Micronesian societies, this was across the board, because you have to remember Chamorro society was very normal until the Spanish stepped in and basically whacked the hell out of it in the 1600s. Uncles, in the sense of your mother's brother, were actually would be the guy that would provide the male role model for the kids in the family, because the kids in the family belong to the mother. So your mom is the head of your family, traditionally in Micronesia. And her brother traditionally would be the person who would provide the male model for the kids. The husband, in other words, your dad, his responsibility would be to his sisters, because of course he would be their kid's uncle. This is actually something I grew up in, because this is a Arapaho Cheyenne society, but it's pretty unusual. We call this avunculocal systems. Don't worry about the term, but it just means that your mom's brother, i.e. your uncle on your mom's side, is actually the male figure that makes the decisions for the family that guys are involved in. Now, that wasn't very much, because the women made most of the decisions traditionally. The Germans, the Japanese, but especially the Americans come in and just absolutely gut that. And so what you've got now is you've got men who are, the dad of the family now has to rear his own kids. But in much of Micronesia, there's no set of normative values on how to raise your own kids because it's not your kids you traditionally raised. If you want to think about it, it'd be the same if you guys suddenly found yourself in traditional Micronesian societies and all of a sudden you've got to raise your sister's kids, but you don't raise your own kids. In fact, you don't even interact very much with your own kids. Most folks here would have an incredibly difficult time figuring out how they're supposed to act. You see this to certain blended families, for example. That's one of the huge changes in Micronesian societies is the destabilization of the cultural value system by just the ineptitude and disinterest of the United States. Traditionally in Micronesian, as in the rest of the Pacific and most of the other groups we've ever seen here, being old is hugely important. It's the whole sort of kapuna thing we always talk about here. And age, and especially authority in women, were the folks that ruled the family. They ruled the area. You know, the equivalent to a matai would be the oldest woman in the family would sort of wield the rod. The Germans, the Japanese, and the Americans come in, and of course they put all the authority on guys. So they basically gut women in a position of authority and replace them with men. In the American system under the US military, they were entirely disinterested in age. And so the Americans actually set people up as chiefs, and the marshals actually set some poor guy up as king. I don't know how the hell they figured that out. So they basically just overlaid their fairy tale view of how these places should be with absolutely no interest in how the system actually worked. And then, of course, because the Americans were in charge of the legal system, they make it stick. So what you have is over time is age just becomes a problem. Age just becomes like it is in the mainland United States. You're old. That means, you know, someone sort of hopes you just sort of like disappear somewhere because you're now just a pain in the ass and put you in a nursing home. That's an American attitude that gets dropped on Micronesia. It doesn't happen in Polynesia because they leave the Polynesians sort of alone. Okay? But it certainly is true in Micronesia. So what you have is age and authority get completely pulled apart. You still see that maybe in families, but there's no legal relationship to it. In traditional Micronesian societies, even under the Japanese and the Germans, the oldest member of the family could basically disown family members, could take property from them, could take their kids from them, could do anything they wanted to them. They were the head of the family. Under the Americans, that just stops. So the American legal system just gutted the Micronesian value system, and then it's been in place since 1945. You know, basically, when these places become independent, they keep the American system. So right into 2020, same. So now what, 70 going on 70, 80 years of this. You know, you pick up among other things, it's been a huge problem. If you look at, for example, alcoholism and such in Micronesia, drug use in Micronesia, family violence in Micronesia, and in Micronesia, especially the marshals, you find a huge part of it is tied to the fact that, among other things, they picked up, because of this exposure through the US military, they picked up this idea of the teenager and the idea that teenagers are actually legitimate functioning family members. And I don't think I actually mentioned this, both in Micronesia and in Polynesia, especially in Polynesia, you see this with Tatao. Traditionally in Polynesian society, you don't decide what you are. The family decides when you're an adult. So traditionally in Samoa and Tonga, you became adult in your late 20s, early mid 30s. And if you're of the upper section of the family, that's when you get a tatau, and a tatau marks your adult status. At that point, your entire behavior, the way you act, the way you interact with people has to totally change, because now you're a visible, viable part of the family. So if you're not an adult, then you can act like a kid. This has caused a huge amount of troubles in Polynesian societies in the 21st century, because what you have is more and more an embracing of the American thing where adulthood becomes a calendrical thing. It's based on your actual physical age. And the legal requirements, of course, of the US system. But it's not based on behavior, whereas traditionally in Polynesia, it's behavior and the way that you act. When you act like an adult, then you're treated as an adult, you go through a ceremony and you become an adult. This was also true in Micronesia. Most folks did not become adults. Women did by the time they were in their late teens. Guys didn't become adults in almost any part of Micronesia until they were in their early 30s. So prior to that, you could sort of act like a kid and people would cut you some slack because you weren't adult, didn't have to be responsible. What happened is that still sort of persisted, but now you've rolled it into the American idea of the teenager and being able to do what you want to. And this is one of the huge problems in Micronesian societies, especially, even more so than Polynesian, is the idea of someone who's teen through their 20s that doesn't have to act responsibly, doesn't have to take on the idea of role behavior of an adult because they sort of embrace this idea that they get to do what they want to. They've taken the part of Micronesian society which said they don't have to be responsible, and they've parlayed that into the American system, which theoretically by the time you're 16, you get in trouble after 16. That's an adult crime. You're tried as an adult. In their view, they could be 28 and still beat up their mom. They should be tried as a kid. So they're taking what they see as the most advantageous parts of two value systems and trying to play them out. It's a huge issue. My sister works with social services, or did for 20 years. And that was the big problem, was Micronesians under the age of 30 who never really embraced the idea of what adulthood was because they didn't have to and didn't want to. It's really convenient to stay a kid because you pretty much engage in all sorts of antisocial or unacceptable behaviors with no consequence to it. So and again, it's not that societies were screwed up. It's that what you get is the overlay of American society coming in as like this big hammer and just basically dislocating the entire system, but providing no real viable, organized, structured alternative. I guess to a certain extent, maybe the advantage the Chamorros had was that the Spanish hit everything with a big hammer, but the Spanish didn't tell you what the new system is. This is the way you do stuff. This is the only way you do stuff, and bang, here's how it's going to happen. So you don't see the same type of situation on Guam with Chamorros that you do in much of the rest of Micronesia, because the Americans just, whatever. So I guess I won't get this one done. So that's really sort of the really key parts. Well, actually, I guess I have covered all this. All this pretty much then becomes fairly obvious. You just sort of work this through mentally. Most Micronesians, I think, in many ways, you could argue when they come over here, you could sort of say that they're lost. They have a traditional set of values and attitudes. I think I mentioned this earlier in the semester. Micronesia is one of the areas I've tried for years to get, and I know some of my friends that work in the area. I've tried for years to get Micronesian governments to start oral history recording programs, to actually start collecting the information from the old folks before the old folks pass on. We've never got any interest from any Micronesian government. They've actually, in one case, in the case of Blau, they actually had the money. They actually, two of my friends got them the money from the federal government to actually do this, and the money disappeared, and they never did any work. So the traditional Micronesian societies, what little is left, has been rapidly disappearing. For many of the islands, especially true in the Marshalls, people don't even remember the names because where they live isn't where they're from. They live in some place like Ebai near Kwajalein, but they might be from an island that's 150 miles to the south. But as the old folks pass away, the younger generation never lived in that. They've never even seen that island. So they don't remember the names of that place. They don't remember the stories attached to it. They don't remember the stories of their ancestors. So, if there's a discussion that, for example, Hawaiians have lost parts of their culture because of Western contact, that's certainly true. But what's really sort of terrifying is how quickly that's occurred in Micronesia, since the vast majority of that was post-1945 in American control. And it wasn't because Americans forced them to be different. They just didn't care. They placed no value on it. And the powers that be and the governments in Micronesia have followed that same trend. There's very little interest in preserving or recording traditional aspects of culture before they disappear. And of course, if you're familiar with the Hokulea on Mount Pialog, that's a classic example. Your main navigator teaching Hawaiians navigation is from Micronesia. But he teaches the folks here because no one in Micronesia was interested in learning. They eventually sent a program back to train some Micronesians, and it's not been compelling. So it's a really sad situation, but it's a good example of massive culture dislocation. And of course, then Micronesians pay the price. And of course, to a certain extent, then we're, along with Micronesians, are left trying to figure out what you do in the 21st century, say, for example, on the island of Oahu with this population package of different folks. I'm not very cheerful, I guess. Actually, when we look at Tuesday, when we finish up, Southeast Asians are real interesting as sort of a same period, but entirely different in many, many ways, which is sort of intriguing. So any questions on all that?
Have there been any American politicians that have tried to fix the deal that they have with Micronesia?
Nope. I think from a very cynical standpoint, if you're an American politician, if I'm the senior senator from what's McConnell, Kentucky, I think. So if I'm McConnell, I'm head of the U.S. Senate, and I suddenly decide I'm going to do this, my advisors are going to tell me, don't get involved in it. These folks are not American citizens. They don't vote. All you're going to be seen as taking money from good American citizens to spend in some other place that's not part of the United States. So it's going to be seen as a foreign airfare thing. Never mind. And if you try to bring in history, Americans have no sense of history. Americans don't even remember what happened 5 or 10 years ago. So if you suddenly bring up the stuff we did in World War II, the only thing Americans are going to remember is, oh, a lot of folks died in Micronesia. A lot of Americans died in battles, which is true in Micronesia. And yeah, I think we used to light bombs off there. And that's it. There's no sense of responsibility for populations that we totally screwed up, which I hate to say is pretty much American policy. If you talk to Puerto Ricans and you want to talk about American control, in fact, you remember that in the whole issue over the last, 5 or 10 years after the huge hurricane hit there. You know, boy, if you're an American colony, you're screwed. You know, if you're a territory, you're not going to get anything because you're not a voting citizen. So therefore, no one in Congress is going to pay any attention to you. You're not relevant to their world. And that's why Hawaii went to such desperate straits to become a state in 1959, because they had realistically realized, you know, you're always going to be the back of the tail of the dog unless you actually became in Congress and you had votes and you can actually, you know, sit on committees and do shit. So yeah, Micronesia, American Samoa, Guam, Puerto Rico, they're not happy campers. And sad to say, I wish I could say, oh yeah, you know, every generation you see a couple of guys and they make some attempt. Nah, don't even care. In fact, the last time they had that GAO audit about the misuse of funds, they didn't even bother having hearings on the US Congress. They didn't care. So yeah, no, that's one reason why Shaman's involved. We've got a big program trying to provide educational training for folks that teach in the FSM, for the simple reason the federal government won't do it. It's their job. It's part of what they gave the Micronesians money for. They could give a shit. So no, as you can tell, I get a little bit agitated about all this, but yeah. Oh well, federal government. So any other questions? And I promise I won't go off. None?